It is no secret that the Game of Thrones franchise, after becoming an international phenomenon during the original show's run, hit a brick wall due to a number of reasons, most notably the desire of showrunners David Benioff and D.B. Weiss to wrap up the series and move on to what they considered bigger and better projects. George R.R. Martin's books are phenomenal. The only problem is that the guy writes slow as hell, so the show's quality took a noticeable decrease around the season 5 mark. The lack of source material would not have been a problem, however, if the team behind the show had any understanding of what made the early seasons successful to begin with. It wasn't battle scenes, dragons, Khal Drogo's army, the Unsullied, or even the show's grand sense of scale across continents and families. It wasn't the big plot twists like the Red Wedding. It was actually the small moments, the attention to detail, that made Game of Thrones such a hit. It was the scene-by-scene intrigue, witty dialogue, flawed characters who we hated and then eventually loved over time. It was the morally gray themes, which at the time of Game of Thrones' initial release was revolutionary in television. Who remembers when Game of Thrones was being hyped up as The Sopranos meets Lord of the Rings? Fantasy for people who hate fantasy. These marketing taglines from the show's infancy attempted to define the unique signature style of George R.R. Martin's storytelling, a style that has since become all too common, thanks to many copycats. It was this unique voice, the world-building and unorthodox approach to character development that made the show such a hit, but the production team, drunk on their own success, was blind to this reality. Thus, such attention to detail was lost in its final 2 seasons, and especially the final season. In OG Game of Thrones, a character might spend the entire season traveling across the realm, but by the final few episodes, characters were constantly zigzagging across Westeros within minutes, like they all owned private helicopters. The greatest strength of the show, that attention to detail, became the show's greatest weakness. The production team couldn't even notice obvious mistakes like a Starbucks cup sitting on the table, or that the climactic battle the show had been building towards for a whole decade wasn't even filmed with proper exposure and lighting. Game of Thrones had more than lost its magic. When House of the Dragon was announced, I merely rolled my eyes. It seemed like another cash-in, the dying breath of a series far past its prime. Then they went ahead and announced the Jon Snow sequel series, and I laughed. HBO was trying to turn Game of Thrones into a Marvel-like shared universe. I couldn't have been more disinterested if I tried to be. This coming from me, who was a Game of Thrones fan before almost anyone I know. I read the books when I was 12 in the 8th grade, when the first season was still airing. I was with the series for the highs, like the masterful 4th season, and the lows, like the exclusion of Lady Stoneheart, one of my favorite plot twists from the books. Her exclusion is one of many foolish decisions made by David Benioff and D.B. Weiss. One could make a compelling argument that the best season of Game of Thrones was actually its 6th. Although Season 6 was produced after the show had surpassed the books, scripts were written with the help of some plot outlines from George R.R. Martin. The pacing was getting faster, but it was not the bullet train that Season 7 and 8 turned into. We also got one of the greatest episodes in television history, Battle of the Bastards, and there finally seemed to be some payoff to long-running storylines from the first 5 seasons. And that leads to one of the main reasons House of Dragon is a success. One of its showrunners, Miguel Sapochnik, is the guy who was responsible for the Battle of the Bastards, as well as the iconic Hardhome. This guy gave us 2 of the greatest hours ever aired on television. Yeah, he also directed The Long Night, but whatever, everyone makes mistakes. He's a tested and talented filmmaker who has proven he can carry the weight of this franchise when it counts. And by promoting him to showrunner for this series, HBO at the very least had displayed an understanding of the need for these shows to be high quality. A promising start. At the time of House of the Dragon's release, society has fully existed within the era of content. The post-pandemic surge of new shows and movies, many of which are attempts at franchises and shared universes, aired on competing streaming services. 2022 indeed has been an incredible year for TV, from The Boys Season 3 to Peacemaker, to original shows like Severance. As the final third of the year rolled around, all eyes turned to fantasy. It was Westeros versus Middle-earth. HBO's House of the Dragon was to be released at the same time as Amazon's Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, the latter apparently being the most expensive TV series ever produced. And although the production teams of both shows kept it civil, publicly wishing the other success, from the fans' perspective it was clear that the two were to be compared. It was inevitable. It only took a couple of episodes for everyone to see how that rivalry would progress. Rings of Power premiered to massive viewership, only to fall off after everyone realized how boring, poorly written, and overly dramatized it was. House of Dragons, on the other hand, surprised everyone with its opening episode, actually being pretty good. Then the following week, it was consistent. By the time of the 3rd episode's release, it was clear that House of Dragons was going to be a good series. Its viewership numbers reflected this, actually going up episode by episode, as positive word of mouth convinced those on the fence to give it a shot. By the 4th episode's release, there was very little discussion of Rings of Power remaining, let alone in the same sentence as House of Dragons. There was no contest. The team behind House of Dragons knew what made Game of Thrones a success in its earlier seasons and doubled down, as discussed before. It wasn't the flashy set pieces, dragons, the fight scenes, it was the intrigue, characters, and dialogue. It was the slow burn with reward. Somehow, House of Dragons managed to evolve these core strengths of Game of Thrones into a story that is actually quite fast-paced, spanning decades. Major actors change halfway through the season, and yet, somehow, each scene feels like it takes its time, delicately. The show manages to hold a slow pace, moment to moment, and a fast pace, episode to episode. There are no filler episodes here. Even the original Game of Thrones was guilty of being too slow at times, when it would feel like nothing would happen until the final 10 minutes of an episode. Not here. House of the Dragon is expertly paced. Every episode is significant. The plot and characters develop in each scene. It is truly masterful television plotting. All TV writers should study what the writing team of this show accomplished, how to be fast-paced and slow-paced at the same time. In line with the pacing is what the show chooses to focus on. Although the show has dragon in the title, this title implies a much higher fantasy component than is actually the case. Ultimately, this is a story about politics and family. There are classic Game of Thrones elements. The viewer is encouraged to question the motivations of the various characters. Fight scenes are rare enough that they carry weight, and frequent enough that the show feels action-packed. But dragons themselves are used seldom, treated more like weapons of mass destruction within the context of the competing factions, instead of being an all-purpose tool for convenient plot devices and action scenes. Not to mention that when dragons are on the screen, they look absolutely terrifying. The CGI is excellent. It really shows you how far technology has come, and it puts some of the recent outings from CGI-heavy Marvel to shame. I mean, seriously, the fact that House of Dragons was released at the same time as She-Hulk should be an absolute embarrassment. Dragons rarely appearing on screen increases their impact when they are present. The finale has one of the most impressive action sequences in Game of Thrones history. The CGI and weather effects in this particular scene was beautiful filmmaking. It's one of the most tense and well-written scenes of this entire franchise. Another plus of the writing is the way it handles diversity. In this modern political and cultural era, there has been a concerted effort to give non-white actors and actresses more opportunities. This is a good thing, of course, but the wokest of stories have laughable implementation of diversity. A sort of colorblind approach where the race or ethnicity of a character is both glaringly obvious but also watered down to the point of losing its significance. Look at Rings of Power as an example. I don't want to dwell on the debate regarding black dwarves and Hispanic elves or whatever the hell it is, but I do know that when I've discussed this topic with friends of diverse backgrounds, many find it laughable. Lord of the Rings is, after all, a tale of Anglo-Saxon mythology. Spoiler alert, Anglos are white. Forcing diversity into that cast would be sort of like making Daniel Craig the King of Wakanda and expecting people to pretend like everything is normal. Diversity is not the problem. The ultimate problem is actually, this simply pulls the viewer out of the universe and story. If a viewer is reminded of real-world political or social movements, and this is supposed to be the fantasy genre, that means the production team did something wrong. So how does a show be inclusive and diverse without pulling the viewers from the world? How can a writing team be respectful and cognizant of real-world circumstances without feeling like its primary objective is the pursuit of their chosen socio-political slant? The answer is to do what House of the Dragon did, instead of what Rings of Power did. That is, make identity matter to the character's storyline. For example, one of the strongest components of original Game of Thrones was its strong female characters. Remember when a female character could be strong without having to 1v6 a squad of muscular male soldiers? Game of Thrones created strong female characters that viewers universally rooted for, without force-feeding a man-hating agenda. A fundamental hallmark of woke storytelling is diversity for its own sake without any relevance to the storyline and/or character. Incidentally, the decision of House of Dragons to make the Valyrians black had a legitimate impact on the progression of the storyline. Rhaenyra's children looked nothing like her husband, who was black, causing rumors to spread around the realm that Rhaenyra's children are bastards. Within the context of the line of succession in House Targaryen, the fact that Rhaenyra's kids do not look biracial adds a tremendous amount of tension to the storyline. It is also the realistic domino effect of what would actually happen in such circumstances. By acknowledging the race of these characters, the production team managed to make the cast diverse without forcing the viewer to be reminded of real-world cultural situations. As it turns out, those critics who complained about the diversity in Rings of Power typically have nothing but good things to say about House of the Dragons. It's well done, without being woke. It's simply telling a unique and interesting story. Diversity is an enhancement to this storytelling, not a hindrance that pulls you out of the world. More shows and universes should take note. On a related subject, the acting and casting overall are perfect. Every character settles into their role with grace. Of particular note is Paddy Considine, who plays King Viserys. What an incredible actor. If he doesn't at least get an Emmy nomination, then Hollywood may indeed be rotten beyond saving. Also excellent is, of course, Matt Smith as Prince Daemon. Usually, there might be some negatives, some criticisms that hold this show back from being its best. but I don't know if House of Dragons has any serious negatives. There's really nothing obvious that taints the flavor of this experience. Aside from Season 4 and Season 6, House of the Dragons is actually the best that Game of Thrones has ever been. From a writing perspective, but also from a filmmaking perspective. The show feels like the quality production that it is, with confident filmmaking, incredible sets, beautiful costume designs, and everything that we had come to expect from the original Game of Thrones at its peak. House of the Dragons cherry-picked the best elements of the original series, tweaked the formula for the story it wanted to tell, and crafted a masterpiece. After these 10 episodes, I can confidently say that Game of Thrones is back. I can't wait to see what the team at HBO does moving forward. Maybe they know what they're doing after all. The potential is high. Let's hope it delivers.